Everyone. Today we'll cover the second part of our lecture of about the history and origin of English literature, which is the relationship. In this lecture, we'll cover the point relationship of English history with English literature. So, obviously, from the last lecture, we can conclude that there is an intricate relationship between English history as in whatever happened in Britain or England of the time, and how it affected the literature and how people started writing English literature. So when we talk about English literature in this particular context right now, we are talking about the literature which was produced in the British Isles. Okay, the literature which was produced in the British Isles by the English people, by the natives of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Okay, so here when we say a relationship between English history and English literature, we are talking about those parts. So the history of English literature has a national as well as personal interest. National, when we say here, again we are pointing uh, towards Britain. How it holds a national importance towards the people there because their history is defined by the works which were written during that time, which were written during that period. Now, in the next point, we see it is not only the amount of work written by English writers, but also whatever has happened during that time making of the literature. So it is not only the amount of work. When we say amount of work, it does not just mean the number of books which were written during that period, but it also means the writers, about the English writers, their personality, like we talked about personality in the last lecture, and whatever has happened, all the social, political, cultural movements that have taken place during that time, which has affected literature and which has helped in making up of the literature of a particular period. All the schools of thought, all the movements of literature which helped during the particular period, which helped make the literature of the time. Now, English history can be called English history again. When we are talking about English history in particular, we are talking about the British Isles. English history can be called as nation's biography, and literature its autobiography. The literature which was written by the English people can be called the autobiography of the nation. Why biography and autobiography? Because autobiography means that it has been written by the people about their own selves, and that is why we say that literature of any country, so as to say, is an autobiography of that particular country. By reading the literature, we can know about the life of the times and people, what they were most interested in during those times, their passions, their standards of conduct, their taste, their character, etc. So, in English history, when we talk about history, we talk about a lot many social changes that have taken place during that particular time. And in literature, we can know what the writers thought or what the writers perceived of those particular times. You know, how their passions were developed, whatever their likes, whatever their dislikes were, what were the standards, what were the social classes, what were the standards of social classes of the time, what their tastes were, whether they were interested in talking about the medieval literature, whether they were interested in talking about the scholarships, whether they were interested more in philosophy, whether they were interested more in affectations like we see during the Restoration age, and what were the peculiar characters, what were the peculiar, ways of people which can be seen in the literature of the time. And that is why we say that English history can be read more intricately and nicely and elaborately through its literature. Now we talk about the most important aspect of English literature, English language. What is the origin of English language? English, we can say, is a West Germanic language which was originated from Anglo-Saxon dialects. Now, this Anglo-Friscan dialect was brought about in the British Isles in Britain in mid 5th to 7th centuries by Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons were a group of three tribes: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. So these three tribes in England, they came to England, they were barbaric in nature, and they here brought this language, which was why do we call it Anglo-Saxons? Because those were the two strongest tribes during that time, and in this 5th to 7th century, we can say that this dialect originated. So it was dialect at first. It was not a full-fledged language, but rather a dialect. Their language, now we say it is called Old English, and was spoken in England and southern and eastern Scotland in the early Middle Ages. So this language, this Anglo-Saxon language, is called Old English language. It was the language which was spoken by the tribes during that time, and later in all parts of England and Scotland, this language grew. This particular English language grew during the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages are said to have come after the Norman conquest. After the Norman conquest in 11th century. So after the Norman conquest in 1066, Old English was replaced by Anglo-Norman as the language of the upper class. This Anglo-Norman language is called Middle English. Okay, so Anglo-Saxon is called Old English, Anglo-Norman is called Middle English. This was developed in 1066, and Middle English was, came or Middle English, we see the effect of Middle English much uh, brilliantly in the 15th century during the age of Shakespeare or Elizabethan age. Okay, now English obviously it developed from from Old English to Middle English, and during the age of Shakespeare, we say that the modern English came into being. The English, which is very similar to what we speak and what we write right now, came into being or was settled or was structured during the or after 15th century. Now, the origin of English literature, we see how history is related, or how history of English literature is a chronological account of all the works that were written in English, how man or a writer is important while we are reading about English literature. We saw what is the relationship of English literature with English history, and what how language originated and language came into being. Now we see the origin of English literature. The first example of English literature can be found in Anglo-Saxon language. In Old English, there have been many works which were written in Anglo-Saxon dialect, and those are the very first examples of anything that is written, if I'm, pardon me if I'm wrong, but closely related to English. Okay. Now, this age, obviously, the Anglo-Saxons, like we all have oral tradition, Anglo-Saxons also had their oral traditions, and they, in this age, in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Anglo-Saxon age, we see that there were not many written works, but rather there was this oral tradition. Oral tradition plays an important part, plays an important role, because when we are talking about oral tradition, we see that they developed as a form of song or as a form of poetry that people used to sing in the earlier times as a form of encouragement, and also as a form of telling about their heroes to other people, to common people. And so this oral tradition grew, and this oral tradition resulted in the written work, one of those very famous written works which we call as an important part of English literature, and Sometimes it is also referred as the first piece of literature in English language. It is Beowulf. Anonymously written by some Anglo-Saxon writer, but surely to be have sung by some Anglo-Saxon tribes, which later on became a part of a written work. Now, Norman conquest, as we read earlier in 1066, this was a turning point in British history, and from this point onwards, we see the literature being transitioned from oral to written. So here we say Norman conquest is a turning point in British history as the pieces transition from being oral to written. So the oral tradition that was continuing for such a long time in the past can now be seen in the written form. The Middle Ages shaped English literature's framework and as a result produced many literary products. So we can say during the Middle English literature took its shape, the shape that we see right now, and also provided a framework of English literature which is seen very clearly in today's time, in today's era. After 15th century, many genres of literature arose in poetry, theatre and prose. After 15th century, that means we say after the age of Shakespeare or during the age of Shakespeare, during the age of Queen Elizabeth, we see that because she promoted art, culture and literature, we see a lot many types of literature, a lot many genres of literature being flourished, being coming forward, and we see not only poetry. See, oral tradition is somewhere or the other connected with poetry, but we do not see just poetry now. We see theatre, that means drama. We see prose, that means essays, publications, pamphlets, novels also came into being. And this 15th century marked as the point after which English literature never looked back. So that was it. That was the lecture. Hope you like it. We'll continue the topics, the age of English literature, and also talk about the different ages of literature in the coming lectures. Thank you.